first question, what are the factors driving the record environmental disclosures by over 3,400 Chinese companies in 2023?
Well, CDP is really proud of the growth here in China. It's up 26% year on year. So there's a real relevance that's starting to become part of real business here in China. And I think what the driving factor is that it's the C-suite, it's the CEO, the CFO that are starting to understand that this data is not nice to have. It's absolutely must have. And there are three areas within business that this data is becoming more and more relevant and needed. First is access to capital. So companies who are seeking investment are increasingly looking at supplying this data to investors to help make their decision. The second is business efficiencies. This really comes into play when you think about the supply chain. Customers are asking for this data in order to make buying decisions. It also helps a company internally create efficiencies in retaining talent, in attracting good talent, in being able to really justify some of the claims that they're making about sustainability. And third, compliance. Compliance is increasing both here in China and abroad. So access to capital, business efficiencies, and compliance, the ABCs of data use cases, are becoming even more relevant to the business itself. So I see that as being a big driving factor for what's happening here in China. As well, the supply chain and investors that I mentioned really are actually taking a role here in China as well. So CDP is very proud of working with Lenovo and also with JA Solar as supply chain members. These are companies that do business around the world, and they're looking at understanding their own supply chain. And working with CDP allows them to have this data that rolls up into what it is that they're doing. Investors here in China are also growing. eFund, Harvest, China Southern, all are some of our signatories here in China, which are asking for this data in order to take into account as they're making their investment decisions. So I think these are all relevant examples of why that number in China for our disclosure platform is growing rapidly.
Okay, thank you. Disclosure data on environmental information is critical for policymakers and investors. So what measures has CDB taken to ensure the accuracy and validity of this disclosure data? And how do you promote the application and practice of the data on a wider scale?
Right. Well, CDP is the world's comprehensive self-reported data set on environmental and climate factors. This allows us to have much more comprehensive data that is comparable across different markets, across different sectors and industries. I think that that is the underpinning of making sure that verification and quality gets to be comparable in the hands of the users of the data. We also build in the ability to verify. So if you have external verification, that's something that you can upload into our system and again, drive that sense of quality through the system. We also believe that actually using that data for multiple uses is essential because then you actually have the same data that's been reported once, used many times. This drives down the reporting burden, it drives down the cost of reporting, and companies are able to have more focus on the action that's being taken from that data rather than having multiple reporting lines that they have to have. And it's certainly interesting as well to policymakers is the scores that the CDP produces. The very coveted A list, which are the most transparent disclosures in our system, must have their scope 1 and their scope 2 data verified. Again, building that rigor into the system allows CDP to provide best-in-class service and also be able to really listen to the market when it is that they're thinking about what they use the data for and making sure it's comparable.
We know the Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing stock exchanges officially released the final version of the self-disciplinary supervision guidelines for listed companies' sustainability report. Compared with international sustainability disclosure frameworks, what do you think are the highlights and the differences of China's disclosure framework, and how can CDP help Chinese companies cope with the international market's requirements for environmental information disclosure?
So CDP began 23 years ago as a voluntary platform for data to be used by investors, to be used by companies, to be used by policymakers. Here it is 23 years later, and we're celebrating the mandatory disclosure regulation that's coming out in many different areas around the world. In particular, here in China, this leadership from the stock exchanges in China is something that we really applaud. We see it as a great step forward. We also think that increasing the mandatory requirements also increases the need for CDP. At this point, not all mandatory disclosures are the same. So in order to be able to help with what piece of data is relevant for which disclosure around the world, CDP can step up. We can look at how we tag data, how it is we can work with companies, how we can streamline that process. So using the technology that we have, we're able to actually drive that forward. So we see here in China that this first step is a great one to start moving towards other mandatory disclosure defragmentation. In particular, we're really proud this year that CDP is aligned to the IFRS climate standard, the ISSB S2. And this is a great example of how a single piece of data can be used in multiple places. We're already aligned with TCFD since 2018, and we're looking at nature through the TNFD and also aligning with other regulatory frameworks around the world. For example, exporters here in China are going to need to make sure that their disclosures are in line with the European requirements if they're going to export to Europe, which is China's second largest exporting country. So CDP stands ready to help.
Okay, the final question, what are the next steps that CDP will take to help companies disclose and manage their environmental impact in an easier way, especially those SMEs, which are made a major part globally?
I'm glad you asked about SMEs. I think they make up most of the Chinese economy. They make up most of the world economy. And so therefore, their emissions and how it is that they factor into supply chains is essential. Because what we're doing here is not actually just looking at data to think about climate. We're actually using that data to be able to take action. So SMEs are an integral part. We see that from CDP. And this year, for the first time, we're launching an SME module for our disclosure platform. This is easier. This is smaller. This is something to be able to get companies ready for, as they grow, having more disclosures and more transparency. We're also improving and streamlining our platform overall. We previously had 3 different questionnaires. We had climate, we had water, we had forestry. That's being pulled all together and being much more streamlined. So hopefully all of our disclosures, both if they've done it before or the new ones this year, will feel that their efforts are being made with a lot more efficiency. And finally, I mentioned before, but it's worth repeating, is the standards. So increasingly, companies are required to make these disclosures in various parts around the world, including now overall leading up to 2026, planning for that in China. So actually having our platform be able to indicate which of those data sets are going to be needed for mandatory disclosures helps companies along the way. And if we can remind ourselves why, what we're doing is underpinning the sustainable economic growth going forward. In order for companies to be able to sell, to grow, to be able to access capital, to IPO, to be able to move forward in their businesses, increasingly they're going to need to be able to understand their environmental footprint. And through the value of data, they're able to share that with the world. This is now something that is fundamental to good business growth going forward. So we see that China plays a central role in the region. China plays a central role in the world. And being able to increase the amount of disclosure that's coming from Chinese companies is going to underpin global economic growth. So we're standing ready. We're hoping to be able to be supportive, and we're looking forward to continuing our more than decades-long work here in China.